Welcome back to another episode of Ancient Tracks. Today we will be discussing the famous Bauman story, which is told in Theodore Roosevelt's 1893 publication of The Wilderness Hunter, the final book of his 2 volumes and 600 pages about his Western experiences, containing everything you need to know of the wilderness. Prior to this publication, Teddy Roosevelt was an avid sportsman, a rancher in the Dakota Territories, authored at least 5 books, a public servant and husband and father. In years to come, Roosevelt became our first conservation president, establishing 150 national forests, the first 55 federal bird reservations and game preserves, national parks, and the first 18 national monuments. In the book, The Wilderness Hunter, Roosevelt retells a story of an old frontiersman named Bauman. It is important to add that Roosevelt had a reputation of calling out your falsehoods and had no reservations calling you a liar. The Bauman story happened in the mid-1880s on the Wisdom River, now known as the Big Hole, a remote section of the Montana wilderness. Teddy Roosevelt's retelling is as follows. Frontiersmen are not, as a rule, apt to be superstitious. They lead lives too hard and practical, and have too little imagination in things spiritual and supernatural. I have heard but few ghost stories while living on the frontier, and those few were of a perfectly commonplace and conventional type. But I once listened to a goblin story, which rather impressed me. A grizzled, weather-beaten old mountain hunter by the name of Bauman, who was born and had passed all his life on the frontier. He must have believed what he said, for he could hardly repress a shudder at a certain point of the tale. But he was of German ancestry, and in childhood had doubtless been saturated with all kinds of ghost and goblin lore, so that many fearsome superstitions were latent in his mind. Besides, he knew well the stories told by the Indian medicine men in their winter camps, of the snow walkers and the specters, and the formless evil beings that haunt the forest depths, and then dog and waylay the lonely wanderer who after nightfall passes through the regions where they lurk. And it may be that when overcome by the horror of the fate that befell his friend, and when oppressed by the awful dread of the unknown, he grew to attribute, both at the time and still more in remembrance, weird elfin traits to what was merely some wicked and cunning wild beast. But whether this was so or not, no man can say. When the event occurred, Bauman was still a young man, and was trapping with a partner among the mountains dividing the forks of the salmon from the head of the Wisdom River. Having had not much luck, he and his partner determined to go up into a particularly wild and lonely pass through which ran a small stream said to contain many beavers. The pass had an evil reputation because the year before a solitary hunter who had wandered into it was slain, seemingly by a wild beast, the half-eaten remains being afterwards found by some mining prospectors who had passed his camp only the night before. The memory of this event, however, weighed very lightly with the 2 trappers, who were as adventurous and hardy as others of their kind. They took their 2 lean mountain ponies to the foot of the pass, where they left them in an open beaver meadow, the rocky timber-clad ground being from there onward impractical for horses. They then struck out on foot through the vast gloomy forest, and in about 4 hours reached a little open glade where they concluded to camp, as signs of game were plenty. There was still an hour or 2 of daylight left, and after building a brush lean-to and throwing down and opening their packs, they started upstream. The country was very dense and hard to travel through, as there was much down timber, although here and there the somber woodland was broken by small glades of mountain grass. At dusk they again reached camp. The glade in which it was pitched was not many yards wide, the tall, close-set pines and firs rising round it like a wall. On one side was a little stream, beyond which rose the steep mountain slope, covered with the unbroken growth of evergreen forest. They were surprised to find that during their absence something, apparently a bear, had visited camp, and had rummaged about among their things, scattering the contents of their packs, and in sheer wantonness destroying their lean-to. The footprints of the beast were quite plain, but at first they paid no particular heed to them, busying themselves with rebuilding the lean-to, laying out their beds and stores and lighting the fire. While Bauman was making ready supper, it being already dark, His companion began to examine the tracks more closely, and soon took a brand from the fire to follow them up, where the intruder had walked along a game trail after leaving the camp. When the brand flickered out, he returned and took another, repeating his inspection of the footprints very closely. Coming back to the fire, he stood by a minute or two, peering out into the darkness, and suddenly remarked, "Bauman, that bear has been walking on two legs." Bauman laughed at this, but his partner insisted that he was right, and upon again examining the tracks with a torch, they certainly did seem to be made by but two paws or feet. However, it was too dark to make sure. After discussing whether the footprints could possibly be those of a human being, and coming to the conclusion that they could not be, the two men rolled up in their blankets and went to sleep under the lean-to. At midnight Bauman was awakened by some noise, and sat up in his blankets. As he did so, his nostrils were struck by a strong, wild beast odor, and he caught the loom of a great body in the darkness at the mouth of the lean-to. Grasping his rifle, he fired at the vague, threatening shadow, but must have missed, for immediately afterwards he heard the smashing of the underwood as the thing, whatever it was, rushed off into the impenetrable blackness of the forest and the night. After this the men slept but little, sitting up by the rekindled fire, but they heard nothing more. In the morning they started out to look at the few traps they had set the previous evening and put out new ones. By an unspoken agreement they kept together all day and returned to camp towards evening. On nearing it they saw, hardly to their astonishment, that the lean-to had again been torn down. The visitor of the preceding day had returned, and in wanton malice had tossed about their camp kit and bedding, and destroyed the shanty. The ground was marked up by its tracks, and on leaving the camp it had gone along the soft earth by the brook. The footprints were as plain as if on snow, and after a careful scrutiny of the trail, it certainly did seem as if, whatever the thing was, it had walked off on but two legs. The men, thoroughly uneasy, gathered a great heap of dead logs, and kept up a roaring fire throughout the night, one or the other sitting on guard most of the time. About midnight the thing came down through the forest opposite, across the brook, and stayed there on the hillside for nearly an hour. They could hear the branches crackle as it moved about, and several times it uttered a harsh, grating, long-drawn moan, a peculiar sinister sound. Yet it did not venture near the fire. In the morning the two trappers, after discussing the strange events of the last 36 hours, decided that they should shoulder their packs and leave the valley that afternoon. They were more ready to do this because in spite of seeing good game sign they had caught very little fur. However, it was necessary first to go along the line of their traps and gather them, and this they started out to do. All the morning they kept together, picking up trap after trap, each one empty. On first leaving camp, they had the disagreeable sensation of being followed. In the dense spruce thickets, they occasionally heard a branch snap after they had passed, and now and then there were slight rustling noises among the small pines to one side of them. At noon they were back within a couple miles of camp. In the high, bright sunlight their fears seemed absurd to the two armed men, accustomed as they were, through long years of lonely wandering in the wilderness, to face every kind of danger from man, brute, or element. There were still 3 beaver traps to collect from a little pond in a wide ravine nearby. Bauman volunteered to gather these and bring them in, while his companion went ahead to camp and made ready the packs. On reaching the pond, Bauman found 3 beavers in the traps, one of which had been pulled loose and carried into the beaver house. He took several hours securing and preparing the beaver, and when he started homewards he marked, with some uneasiness, how low the sun was getting. As he hurried toward camp, under the tall trees, the silence and desolation of the forest waited upon him. His feet made no sound on the pine needles, and the slanting sun rays, striking through among the straight trunks, made a gray twilight in which objects at a distance glimmered indistinctly. There was nothing to break the gloomy stillness which, when there is no breeze, always broods over these somber primeval forests. At last he came to the edge of the little glade where the camp lay and shouted as he approached it, but got no answer. The campfire had gone out, though thin blue smoke was still curling upwards. Near it lay the packs wrapped and arranged. At first Bauman could see nobody, nor did he receive an answer to his call. Stepping forward, he again shouted, and as he did so his eye fell on the body of his friend, stretched beside the trunk of a great fallen spruce. Rushing towards it, the horrified trapper found that the body was still warm, but that the neck was broken, while there were 4 great fang marks at the throat. The footprints of the unknown beast creature, printed deep in the soft soil, told the whole story. The unfortunate man, having finished his packing, had sat down on the spruce log with his face to the fire and his back to the dense woods to wait for his companion. While thus waiting, his monstrous assailant, which must have been lurking in the woods, waiting for a chance to catch one of the adventurers unprepared, came silently up from behind, walking with long, noiseless steps and seemingly still on 2 legs. Evidently unheard, it reached the man and broke his neck by wrenching his head back with its forepaws, while it buried its teeth in his throat. It had not eaten the body, but apparently had romped and gamboled around it in uncouth, ferocious glee, occasionally rolling over it. It had then fled back into the soundless depth of the woods. Bauman, utterly unnerved and believing the creature with which he had to deal was something either half human or half devil, some great goblin beast, abandoned everything but his rifle and struck off at speed down the pass, not halting until he reached the beaver meadows where the hobbled ponies were still grazing. Mounting, he rode onwards through the night until beyond reach of pursuit.
That's so sad, y'all.
It gets better.
Well, it says Roosevelt was obviously impressed with the validity of the tale as to share it along with his own reflections of life in the wilderness, apparently believing a man as tough and stoic of a character as Bauman rendered able to hardly repress a shudder while reliving the distant memory as proof enough. That's how it ends.
Okay. Forrest.
Okay, well, here's my uh, take on some of this. I have listened to the Bowman story several times, and I'm not sure if it's pronounced Bowman or Bauman or what,
Yeah.
really the true pronunciation of his name. But the thing, I don't know what got me to thinking about this, and I actually had to call Chuck last night and ask him if he thought I was completely, totally off my rocker for thinking this. But I had been reading the story about the Bauman incident, and then I watched a video on it, and I got to thinking, okay, throughout all of this, as technical and as detailed as Roosevelt always is in all of his writings,
Mm-hmm.
he never ever once referred to Bauman by his first name. And I thought that to be highly unusual, because always in all of his other books and stuff, he gives credit back when he was hunting in the Northeast to a couple of gentlemen that he used to hunt with and trap with. He always gave first and last names. So I was like going, why would this man not use a trapper's first name? And I'm going to tell you why, and you can tell me I'm totally crazy, but I think Bauman was Roosevelt, is what I think. I think this was something that happened to him in your early years, and he picked up and just used a name and mixed it. I mean, he was a colorful writer. He really was. And I think he just used the accounts of some old trapper and mixed it in there, because I think this all occurred before. And that was the only thing I never could figure out. I never could find an exact date when he actually talked to Bauman. And I could see where it might be a slight disadvantage for him if he had political aspirations, that he would be saying that he'd had an encounter with a Bigfoot. I mean, people, they wouldn't have called it a Bigfoot. They would have called it a wild man, at that point in time, or an ape man or something like that. There were definite different terminology for them. But we call them Bigfoot now, so I'll just refer to them as Bigfoot. It's not that he referred to them that way, because he did not. I think that would have had a vast, irreparable, negative impact on his having a political ambition. So, as great as the man was, we know how the craziest things, the smallest things, can impact elections.
Right.
They still do to this day. People are apt to believe anything. So, even made-up stories. And I don't think this was a made-up story. I think this, like I say, call me crazy, but I think that he was, in fact, the one that experienced the incident. I mean, it just is very detailed. And I realize that you can talk to people, and then when you recount a story, you can remember stuff in detail. But there's always little teeny tiny details that you're not going to necessarily remember. And I don't think he was sitting there by the campfire taking notes from some trapper. Now, he might have been. I don't know. You know, I didn't know Teddy personally, but maybe he did take the copious notes. I don't know. But I somehow don't think that he did. And I think he had a great memory, but I think that he also had a vast knowledge of language, and he was quite verbose, and he could tell a good story. So you could take it from there, Chuck.
Well, one thing that after Forrest talked to me about it, it made sense to me. And Teddy, he knew the Montana Territory pretty well.
Especially the Bitterroot Range.
And there's even a report that I found where he at one time was even a sheriff in Montana. And I found a picture, or somebody sent me a picture, a black and white picture of Teddy Roosevelt, Wyatt Earp, and a couple of the other Earps were there. And so was Doc Holliday, and so was Beth Matheson. And supposedly...
Chuck, I'm going to interject here. I'm going to jump here and say that after you told me about that, I actually looked it up. I found it as well out there. It is out there on the internet. You can find it.
Okay. And supposedly they were going on a hunt. Well, what were they hunting? I think that my belief is, for whatever it's worth, is I believe that Teddy was the one that the event happened. And he had all these guys come in to go on a hunt looking for this thing, and had probably the best shooters in the country at that time as his sidekicks to try to find this and kill this thing. All that is circumstance, as far as that's just my opinion. But why would he have all these gunslingers with him going on a hunting trip in Montana Territory? And the only thing I can think of is that they were out to get this thing, whatever it was.
I'm gonna jump in here and say something about Teddy, because I did go ahead and read a couple of things up on him, and he considered hunting a noble event. He never hunted just for the sake of killing things. He did not enjoy just killing things. There was always a reason. He even actually went to Africa on a safari, and it was a hunting safari, but the reason for the hunting safari was that they were gathering animals, all these specimens, for the Smithsonian, for them to mount. And so that they wanted it to be the most grand, and which it is. If you've ever been to the Smithsonian, I have not been, but my daughter, since her husband works in Washington, D.C., has been there, and she sent me back pictures. And it's most impressive. And he considered it to be a noble event. So there would have had to been purpose in mind. They weren't just going out there to kill anything and everything. So
Right.
We need to keep that in mind. Right. About how he conducted his hunting. He considered these to be not just the savage beasts, but the noble beasts. what did Roosevelt do as soon as he became president? What was
Mhm.
Roosevelt so famous for? He was the one
National Forest.
wanted all these national parks started. He wanted to protect animals from all us naked apes. So I think personally, Roosevelt probably had respect for this savage wild man. He probably had some fear too, but I think too, after you pointed that out, I got to thinking, I wondered if that was not some great hunt that they all organized, the greatest shooters of that time.
Right.
Right.
Of that.
I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but none of them were trappers.
Yeah.
By trade. That's not what they did.
I just wonder in the story if there was somebody, if Teddy was the one who experienced all that. I just wonder who the guy was that was with him. Because I think that there was a trapper with him when they went out there.
Yeah.
I don't think that it was just him solo. I think there was somebody else there.
Well, I think you're probably correct too, because I don't think, like I said, I don't think this was a story he created. You know.
No.
Well, the other guy's name was never mentioned, was it?
No.
No, it was not.
Which, if you look at it that way, maybe there was a Bauman.
Yeah, maybe Bauman was the one that was actually killed.
Right.
And because we don't know Bowman's first name, there's no way to track any historical accuracy on that. And so I just wonder if that, yeah, I'm telling you, I just got to thinking about that, and I thought, oh, this is just the craziest notion you've ever come up with, Forrest. And that's when I picked up the phone and I called Chuck and I said, okay, I've got one for you. And and I just approached him. I said, do you think that Bowman was possibly, and I didn't even get it out of my mouth, and he went, Roosevelt?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it makes sense. It makes sense
Yeah.
to me.
Yeah. Well, who would have given the trapper's name? Either Bowman or Roosevelt. Like, who would give it? Because somebody was killed and somebody has to be responsible for that. And if you're the only one up there, you don't want to get falsely accused. It makes sense that the trapper's name was never mentioned.
Well, granted, this is all hypothetical, but I think that we're on the right track.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense with him going into politics, and he's not going to tell a story of him doing that.
Right.
Yeah, and Trapper Bowman had to have known the name of the other individual that was with him. So why did he ever
Absolutely.
mention it?
Right.
And why was that never mentioned?
Absolutely.
So anyway.
I think I think we need to do a little bit more research on this. Since Forrest brings up
I don't know how you would do that, because Teddy wrote it in the book, and Teddy had all the knowledge of that situation, because there's no knowledge coming from Bowman other than what he supposedly gave to Teddy.
Yeah.
Well, and it's not like Bowman ever told the story to anybody else, because you don't hear of anybody else recounting anything like that.
Right.
No.
See, that's what got me to thinking, okay, Teddy Roosevelt's the only person he ever told that story to?
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's very interesting.
Forrest opened up a whole nother can of worms.
Oh, well, I'm infamous for opening up cans of worms, honey. So.
This is like a little more pondering on this.
That's
yeah,
what makes
and the thing about it is, and you said, well, let's do more research. Where are we going to do research? Because as far as I know, to my knowledge, I mean, if somebody else knows something about it, then they need to speak up. If they've heard it someplace else, then they need to speak up. But I have never, ever seen it anywhere recounted other than coming from Theodore Roosevelt.
Right.
Yeah.
Teddy's the only one that's ever told that story.
I totally agree with you.
If you're listening to this and we've missed something or don't know something, put it in the comments so that we can look it up.
Well, it sure makes sense to me as far as his political aspirations. I just think that he turned the story on somebody else. And the fact is that he was probably there and probably lived through it.
Well, Teddy implies in another story when he was talking about being at the campfire that he heard noises and such, and I think that he implied then that he might remember the campfire and he heard loud howlings and such that he had never heard from any other animal in his life.
Yeah.
So I think Teddy knew exactly what was making that noise.
Well, I think he did too.
Yeah.
And I think that's why he brought the gunslingers in with him.
We never heard anything else about the Bigfoot being captured or killed, so I'm assuming that it made the great escape.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he would have put that up in his trophy wall.
Yeah, I think.
I think the Bigfoot saw all these gunslingers coming after him and decided, you know what, it's time for me to get out of here.
Well, maybe something happened on that trip that he was like, oh, maybe he just found a deep respect for them and thought, I got to make sure they have a safe place to live because all these highfalutin gunslingers couldn't even catch it. It's a thought.
Well, it's possible, but I think Teddy Roosevelt had a deep respect for wildlife.
Right, he did.
And I think, I mean, Chuck, what do you think? I think even though with this, there's obvious a fear related in this story of Bigfoot. You can sense the fear and the ominous feelings that was portrayed in this story, but at the same time, there's probably a deep respect for this beast that is far more or far stronger and capable of destroying humans than what damage they could do, because, I mean, they had shot at this thing that first night and evidently never wounded it, or if they did, I don't ever recall of them ever saying anything about any blood spill or anything like that in recounting the story.
Right. I think when he shot at them, at the one that was around the camp, it took off. I don't think that one was ever hit. And, you know, there could have been more than one. I just saying that there was only one that supposedly was seen.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, and I think I've talked about this too before, when Bauman is telling the story about it looked like something had rolled around and stomped around on this poor trapper, exhibiting an exhilaration and evidently a joy at having killed this trapper.
Right.
And that is such a, oh my God, that is such a chimpanzee behavior. They will take, after they've killed another chimpanzee, they will beat on it. I mean, they will the multiple chimpanzees will come up and beat on the body and drag it around like it's some big trophy, and they roll on the ground and just act like fools is what they act like. And I mean, there is actually an exuberance and exhilaration and joy exhibited by them about this kill that they have just made of another chimpanzee. So that's where I go back to saying Bigfoot exhibits such a behavior like chimpanzees. They are a bipedal great ape. And I think that they probably exhibit a behavior that's even more akin to what the billy ape or the Bondi ape, whatever they're going to call them these days. They used to be called just the billy ape, and now I always have to do this disclaimer. Now some of the scientists are calling them Bondi apes, but these great ape, the larger chimpanzees that have behaviors like gorillas, some of these guys are as big as some of the gorillas, and they like to walk bipedally, and they aren't afraid of anything. And they call them the lion killers in Africa. But I'm just telling you, Bigfoot exhibit such a, comparatively speaking, a behavior that is almost identical to that of chimpanzees. And we all know how I dislike chimpanzees.
Yeah.
That love was facetious.
So would Bowman or Teddy Roosevelt at that time really know that behavior of a chimp?
Oh, absolutely not.
It?
No, absolutely not. Neither person would have had any idea. Teddy might have known about chimpanzees because chimps were known about at that point in time. The gorillas were only whispered about, there's something out there that's even bigger than chimpanzees. And people were like, well, taxonomically, they were only recognized in I think it was the 1930s, if I remember correctly. But they had heard about them. It was kind of like the billy apes. They'd heard about those for 30 or 40 years previous to anybody going out there and looking for them.
Right.
Because you know what? The great European minds and American minds are far greater. They know more than those dumb little natives out there. Well, the natives had been telling them for years and years and years that there was there's an ape out here that does these things, and it wasn't until and I think I can't remember what nationality she was, but it was a woman that went out there and studied him, and it was like, oh my God, they do exist. There's these chimpanzees that prefer to, they live on the ground. They're not afraid of any of the big cats, and they prefer to walk around bipedally.
Well, one thing that we can definitely know for a fact is that this was a Bigfoot. This whole story has traits of Bigfoot activity and things that we know now that they actually do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's no doubt that's what came across whoever that was.
Right. Well, it had the foul smell. It had bipedal tracks, and it hulking body with the shadow. And
the limb breaks that took place, all that.
Yeah. I think the most credible is that the way that it treated the body afterwards.
Yeah.
And that wasn't a known description at the time.
Right.
Well, all the behaviors that Bigfoot exhibited at that point in time were not anything that was really particularly known. It might have been known to native peoples, but they weren't writing about it. So, I mean, here's Teddy putting all this down in a book, and this is the first time anything like that was published. He wouldn't have had any vast knowledge of the behaviors of a Bigfoot. And he acted as if this was a first occurrence of any type of, knowledge that he had of this great ape. So none of that would have been anything that he would have found written down someplace. And I mean, just like Chuck said, it's common knowledge nowadays. Common knowledge.
Yeah. And I doubt Bowman, being a frontiersman, knew anything about it. It's crazy that he just described it to a T. No reference to it whatsoever.
I still think Teddy was there.
Yeah. I kind of am too, now that Forrest said that. Because I always did think that it was unusual that they just said Bowman. Well, who's Bowman?
Well, nobody seems to know to this day who Bowman was other than just a trapper.
A trapper.
Yeah. I mean, I may be so far out in left field, but you know what? I think that it's just such a, it's got to just, that's a brain itch right there is what I call that. You got to, you got to wonder. You just have to wonder.
Yeah, there's something else there.
Yeah.
All right. This was a good one. I think we all are in agreement that it's real and that it's possibly Teddy Roosevelt himself.
Yeah.
Throw that one out to the world and let's see who pounces on it.
Well, after people start seeing what we're saying and hearing what we're saying, they may come in agreement with what we're saying.
Right. It said, let me look up something. Maybe you already know. What was Teddy Roosevelt's
Nationality.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't. I have no idea.
He was of Dutch and English ancestry.
Oh, well, I knew he was a wonderful person. He's got Dutch ancestry. Hell, we might be related, for all I know.
So it says there are no other details about Bauman except for that he was of German heritage. I just thought there might be something there to connect him and Teddy as the same person.
That could have been made up too.
Could have been.
Well,
yeah,
yeah.
No, most likely. I'm just trying to find dots to connect. That's all.
Right. Either way, it's a very interesting story, and I definitely believe it was true. And I don't think we'll ever find out for sure if we're on to something about that, but it sure makes sense to me, especially when you had all these gunslingers from the Old West that they all went on a hunting trip with Teddy.
Yeah.
There had to be a reason for that. It's just very interesting.
Well, and I'll tell you something about, everybody always wonders about the teddy bear. I don't know if y'all have ever heard this story. Teddy was down in Mississippi on a black bear hunt, and they couldn't find a black bear to save their souls on this hunt. So finally, the guy that was leading this hunt went and found an old toothless bear, and he tied it to a tree. And I don't know, from the sounds of it, it must have been a pet bear. And so that Teddy could have a bear to take home and mount. And Teddy refused to kill the bear. He said no. He wanted to go out and hunt something, because goes back to, he believed that animals were noble beasts, and they needed to be able to have, it needed to be a fair hunt, in other words. There wasn't just going to be it wasn't just all about the sport of killing. So they turned that bear loose, and I'm assuming that bear lived out his life. But he certainly he didn't go home that day with Teddy. That's how I heard that the teddy bear started.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Isn't that funny? Now, maybe that was just a fictional story, I don't know, that was made up. But anyway, it sounded pretty good. I actually think Teddy was a pretty good old guy, if you ask me.
I think he was too.
We need more Teddy Roosevelts in the world.
Yes, we do.
I found that picture.
You did?
Yeah, it was taken in 1883. And his book, The Wilderness Hunter, was published in 1893.
Okay. Does he say in the book what the year date was that took place?
That's what I'm looking. I don't know when he talked to
Bauman.
I just know that the book was published in 1893, and
it was only accounting of the story, correct? In that book, it wasn't in any other books, I don't believe.
I don't think so either. The picture is called The Gathering.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now that picture's a little different, I think, because the one that I saw the Gathering picture, but that's not the one that I received. The one that I received, there was only about 6 or 7 guys in that picture.
Let's see. It was in Livingston, Montana, and it had Wyatt Earp, Teddy, Doc, Morgan Earp, Montana Mountain Man, Liver Eaton Johnston. It had Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid, Bat Masterson, Harry Britton, I don't know him, Judge Roy Bean, and it was Hunters Hot Springs, Montana, 1883. But it does have a question mark, so I don't know about that.
I saw that picture, but the one that I kind of talked about was just like 6 or 7 guys. It wasn't a whole big group of those guys like that picture that you're talking about.
Okay.
And I think the one that you're actually talking about, there is some questions about some of that, as far as, is Butch Cassidy and Sundance in the same time frame as that picture? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so there's some questions about that photograph, just that, if it's real or not, or if it was just
Yeah.
hoaxed. So
Right. Well, they were saying that so Morgan Earp is supposed to be in there, but he was dead by 1883.
mhm.
Well, the sad thing about it is there's so much out there, but I did see the one that Chuck, you did send me that one that had just the few guys together,
Yeah.
and so I did see that. I did assume that it was the one that was called The Gathering. I just assumed. So you know what assuming does too sometimes. It's sad because you've got so many things that are hoaxed, and it's like, why? Why do you do this?
Why
I
don't
mean,
do
it's kind of like nowadays that we're trying to change history. Well, we don't like history. Nobody said you had to like history, but
Right.
history is what happened. So maybe you better learn what happened so you don't repeat the same mistakes those idiots that came before you did. So,
Yeah.
there's a reason we have history and we learn our history.
That's why you're on the show.
Well, my father was a history professor, so and my kids always tell me, "Mom, you should have taught school." And I said, "No, all of my students would be in the sitting in the principal's office unless they wanted to learn."
Right. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it.
This
Mm-hmm.
is true.
At this point, unknown to us, the recording stopped. This episode seemed to have many recording difficulties throughout, making it extremely hard to edit. Hence the AI voice over in the beginning and now the ending. For that I apologize. The conclusion of the Bauman story was unanimous. We believe it to be factual, and we speculate Bauman might possibly be Roosevelt himself. The show ended without the chance to mention the obvious caveat: Teddy Roosevelt was a truth teller and seeker, so why would he possibly say he was Bauman? We discussed Teddy's aspirations and felt that a tale of an unknown ape man might have been a tale of credibility assassination, but more importantly, one he may have thought of as a cautionary necessity that all his fellow outdoorsmen needed to hear. We look forward to hearing what you think in the comments. With that, we say goodbye and thank you for listening. Until next time, take care, y'all.